So let's imagine you're a time traveler, and let's also imagine that you have just accidentally thrown yourself into the medieval era and have to wait a year until you can travel back to the present. Having absolutely nothing, you're immediately indebted to the owner of the land you appeared on, and now must live out this year as a medieval peasant. So what would you actually be doing all day? During my mornings, right now, I typically get woken up by either the light through my blinds or sometimes a car loudly driving by. This may be the case for you, and as it turns out, both of us are living exactly like medieval peasants did in Middle Age Europe, which is a little weird for me to think about. As a medieval peasant, you would be awoken by a stereotypical morning rooster, or perhaps commotion inside your house if you had a family. You hear a faint toll of a church bell as you prepare to head off to work while surrounded by a hazy, sunny atmosphere, which would become the routine that governed nearly every life in this medieval era. This world has come into existence after centuries of changes that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, including land becoming the measure of wealth. Most people did not live as merchants or soldiers, but as the peasants, who were bound to villages working on the soil that they lived on, and had to abide by the rules of the owners of that soil. But for their time, they simply saw themselves as workers and weren't bothered having less freedom than the workers of today do, because they just didn't see that as an option. And that's because the living conditions and society back then were vastly different. The medieval village, which is where you would be living, was a very tightly woven unit, often surrounded by open fields that were divided into these long, narrow strips of land. Each family worked several of these strips, which were scattered across the owner's estate. Some peasants were bound to the manor as serfs or villeins, meaning they owed labor and rent to the owner. Others were free tenants, paying with coins or produce instead of the service. But whether it was through labor or trading, most lived modest lives and earned their living through relentless work and strong cooperation with their neighbors, even though they had less opportunities than the people do today. Every peasant's home, including yours, was humble and practical. Cottages were built from something called wattle and daub, which were wooden frames packed with clay, mud, and straw, which would be built into walls and topped with thick roofs. A single room might serve as a kitchen, bedroom, and workshop all at once, and this was often the case. Families would sleep on straw pallets and sometimes share space with chickens or a pig, whose body heat helped warm the house throughout long winters. Windows were little more than shutters, and floors were made out of packed dirt. Furniture was very basic, only being made up of a few chairs, a table, and a chest for storing food and clothing. Hygiene was basic too, although washing in streams and wooden tubs was part of the typical peasant routine, which to be fair rivals the hygiene of some modern people. But despite these simple surroundings, a peasant household made the most out of them by having the entire family working together. Men tended to the physically heavier labor of field work, repairing fences, or just managing livestock. Women's roles were less physical but equally demanding, having to juggle baking bread, brewing ale, weaving cloth, tendering gardens, and caring for children, who themselves worked from an early age, scaring away birds from fields, fetching water, or helping with animals, which made having them and raising them actually worthwhile for a peasant family. Their life was a continuous cycle of doing chores and labor, but by cooperating with each other, it felt natural and just something you're supposed to be doing, which then made any extra things like a nicer meal or a slight celebration feel great and made this routine feel worthwhile. The day began before sunrise, especially in summer. A small meal might be eaten before heading out, which for us right now might be eggs, toast, or cereal, but for the peasants was coarse bread dipped in broth, or porridge made from oats and barley, not that different from oatmeal, just without much of the sweetness that we are used to today. The peasant's diet was efficient and repetitive, again bread, vegetables, beans, and the occasional piece of salted meat or cheese. Water was often unsafe to drink, so weak ale or cider was the usual beverage, even for children. Since all the peasants really did was work, this diet was optimized not for long-term health, but to remain nourished at a low cost. After this first meal, their work began. Since others were usually at it already, you'd hear sounds of wooden wheels creaking on the soil across the fields, pulled by horses if the family was fortunate enough to have them. Plowing was hard and slow work. The soil had to be turned, sown, and harrowed in a sequence that had to be followed precisely. In Northern Europe, the introduction of the heavy plow allowed deeper soil to be cultivated, opening up a new farmland and increasing yields. In southern regions, lighter plows and hand tools were more common, but the idea was the same, spending long hours under the sun working with dirt. Now these tasks and routines did change with the seasons. Spring brought plowing and sowing of grain crops like wheat, rye, or barley. Summer meant weeding, scything grass for hay, and tending animals grazing on common pastures. Autumn was the busiest season of all, since now it was time to harvest. Every single able-bodied person joined in, cutting, bundling, and stocking grain, so that they'd have enough to live off of during the winter, which was an actual concern since they didn't have like DoorDash back then, or maybe they did, I'm not too certain. However, even in the cold, tools needed repairing, ditches needed to be cleared, and livestock had to be fed. Families would have spun wool, mended clothing, and patched roofs to prepare for spring. But what was the structure of an actual typical workday? Around midday, peasants paused for their main meal consisting of bread, cheese, and pottage, which is a thick stew made from boiled vegetables and grains. This meal was eaten communally, often in the open field, and it was followed by a short rest before returning to work. By sunset, the light was fading, and the tools were put away. After supper, usually leftovers or a bit of porridge, people gathered near a fireplace and shared news, stories, or sang songs before sleeping. We talked about what men and women did for work, however this was on the lands they lived on. Work for the owner's personal lands was another important duty. Each week, peasants were expected to spend several days laboring there instead of on their own plots. This might involve plowing, reaping, or transporting grains to the barns. Some had to perform what was called boon work, giving extra days of labor during busy seasons in return for protection and the right to farm their strips. Others paid in grain, eggs, or wool as a form of taxes. Every obligation was recorded by the owner's supervisor, who made sure nothing was overlooked. It was the women's contributions, on the other hand, that barely left their property. They managed small kitchen gardens, keeping vegetables, herbs, and a few fruit trees. They also cared for chickens, geese, or a pig, whose meat could supplement an entire family's diet when slaughtered right before winter. In addition, many women spun yarn from wool, weaving cloth or clothing for trade. This work sustained both family and community, though it was rarely recognized outside of the village. Let's also discuss religion, because it guided nearly every aspect of the peasant's life more than it does today. The church's calendar had feast days, saints' festivals, and periods of fasting, which were considered holy days. They were both spiritual and practical breaks, one of the few times peasants could rest, attend a fair, or visit neighboring villages. The church also collected tithes, or like taxes, a tenth of one produce or earnings as a sacred duty. The ringing of the church bells acted as a clock and marked the passing of time to let the peasants know whether it was dawn, midday, or etc. For them, the faith was both comforting but also very practical, and gave them moments to unwind, something that gave their religion a very loyal following. Because although their life was constrained, the village was not joyless. They still had seasoning fairs with music, dancing, and chances to trade goods or news. They still celebrated weddings and had harvest celebrations, sometimes which lasted for days. Simple games, storytelling, and singing were still common forms of leisure. But of course, behind all of that was still their cycle of labor, debt, and duty, just in case you began feeling jealous of the peasant lifestyle. By late summer, the community's focus turned entirely to harvest, the make or break moment of the year, quite literally. The fields were now full of workers swinging sickles from sunrise to sunset, gathering the crops that would determine whether the village survived the coming winter. Children would follow behind, collecting fallen grain from the ground because literally every bit mattered. Villagers worked side by side, often joined by relatives or other laborers. The first bundles of grain were carried to the owner's granary, fulfilling obligations before anyone else could claim their share. The remainder went into the peasants' own stores, packed into sacks and guarded carefully against the damp atmosphere and pests. Once the last bundle was stacked, the peasants finally were given a moment, just one, to celebrate their monthly efforts. The harvest feast was one of the rare times in the year where everyone, from owner to laborer, might share in food, drink, and music. It was exhausting, crucial work, the accumulation of months of effort. The results of those months, if successful, would feed the village, pay the owner's dues, and sustain this balance of life until the next spring. But now your attention turns to preparing for the cold. Harvests were important, but autumn still gave you enough time to collect firewood, salt meat, dry beans and herbs, mend fences, and thatch roofs. Livestock that could not be fed throughout winter had to be slaughtered for food, their meat smoked or salted to last the season. Depending on your region, winter work also meant an increase of spinning wool, weaving cloth, and crafting tools, which were the only real work that could be done by the firelight inside the cottage. You would still continue maintaining your house and supplies, but the rate of work would be slowed down. And remember, the system demanded rents, dues, and taxes in many forms, and is something that could quickly become overwhelming. Some paid with part of their harvest, others by repairing roads, building fences, or transporting goods for the owner. There were also the church costs. These obligations could strain even a good year yield, and a bad harvest often meant hunger or more debt. In parts of France and Germany, you would have been alongside the peasants that protested or fled during times of famine, while in England, you'd be dealt with harshly with others who failed to meet their obligations. This entire cycle of work would happen if you went to northern lands with colder climates. In southern areas, peasants tended vineyards, olive groves, and vegetable gardens. Mediterranean peasants often lived in stone houses which were clustered near hilltop towns, while the northern villagers were the ones who lived in the cottages surrounded by grains. But the fundamental rhythm remained the same everywhere: sunrise to sunset labor with faith and celebrations keeping you going. And that would effectively be the entire day of the medieval peasant. As centuries passed, the peasant was given more and more choices and freedom. Expanding trade networks meant that you could now have a lot more options of what you wanted to contribute besides just farming. Some peasants became artisans or smallholders, selling surplus grain or wool in local markets. Others migrated to towns and started to build their own societies with freer rules, which all leads us back to today. And I'm curious what your takeaways would be from this experience. Would you end up enjoying the simpler, more direct lifestyle, even though it means less freedom? Or would you brute force your way through it and hope it ends sooner? I think that the medieval peasant lifestyle with debts and labor is quite similar to what typical work nowadays is like, just of course with more options and less of a risk if things do go wrong. This was quite a fun video to make and research, and I hope that this answered your questions of what medieval peasants actually did all day. There are a lot more interesting history questions like this one that I would like to turn into videos. So if you enjoyed this video, give it some love, give it some engagement, maybe hype it up. I know that's a new YouTube feature now, but I hope you learned something, and thank you for watching.